She was chosen by the most feared alpha king in the region, and treated like a mistake he couldn't take back. Serena Vale walked into the Blackthorne Empire not as a queen, but as a ghost nobody wanted to see. They called her fragile. They called her a liability, and the man who was supposed to stand beside her? He looked through her like she was already gone. But here's what none of them knew. Silence can be a weapon, and the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one keeping score. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. The morning Serena Vale became Luna of the Blackthorne Pack, it rained. Not the clean, cinematic kind of rain that softens the air and makes everything smell like earth and new beginnings. This was a cold, sideways rain that found the gaps in every coat collar and turned the ceremonial courtyard into a shallow swamp of brown puddles. The stone wolves flanking the pack hall's entrance dripped from their muzzles. The torches sputtered. Half the gathered crowd held their hoods against the wind, and none of them looked particularly happy about standing in the wet to watch Kyle Blackthorne take a mate. Least of all, the mate herself. Serena stood at the edge of the dais in a dress that fit her perfectly. Ivory wool, long-sleeved, cut for a woman with a waist and shoulders both, which she had, and she gripped the small bouquet of pale winter flowers so hard the stems bent. Not from nervousness, from the effort of keeping her hands visible and still, because she had learned early that when wolves were hunting for weakness, they started with the hands. She was 24 years old. She had a lean face with eyes that were darker than they photographed, and a mouth that rarely smiled in public because she'd noticed that her smile made powerful people uncomfortable in a way she hadn't fully decoded yet. She was not fragile. She had a narrow frame, yes, and she moved quietly. Yes, and she had been ill as a child with something that had left a faint scar along her left collarbone, visible when she wore anything low cut, which she now rarely chose to do. But fragile was a word other people had assigned to her, the way people assign words to things they can't categorize. And she had stopped arguing about it because argument requires an audience that's listening. Nobody in the Blackthorne Pack was listening to Serena Vale yet. At the center of the dais, Alpha King Kyle Blackthorne stood with his jaw set and his shoulders squared against the rain like the weather was something he could stare into submission. He was 31. Built like a man who had learned early that his size was information, and he'd never unlearned it. Dark hair, almost black in the wet. A scar along his right jawline from a challenge fight 6 years back. Clean, thin, the kind of man kept because removing it felt like erasing a fact. His eyes were the particular gray of winter clouds right before they commit to a storm. He had not looked at her. That was the detail Serena fixed on during the ceremony. Not the crowd's murmuring, not the weight of Elder Harwick's traditional words bouncing off wet stone and dissolving in the rain, not even the moment when Kyle pressed his thumb to her wrist in the bonding mark rite with the clinical efficiency of a man completing a form. He had not looked at her. His gaze tracked somewhere above and past her left shoulder, like he was watching for something on the horizon more important than the woman standing 3 feet in front of him. She took the bonding mark without flinching. The burn of it went up her arm and settled into her chest with a dull, permanent ache. The crowd made the obligatory noise, a sound somewhere between a cheer and a clearing of throats. The pack bond clicked into place inside her like a door she hadn't known was closed. And that was that. The celebration dinner was held in the main hall, long tables draped in black and silver, the Blackthorne colors, and the torches had been brought inside so the whole room smelled of pine pitch and wet wool from 200 bodies coming in out of the rain. Serena sat at the high table in the seat to Kyle's left. His beta, a thick-necked man named Aldrich Voss, sat to his right, and it was immediately apparent which direction the Alpha King turned when someone spoke to him. "The Greystone delegation has confirmed for the summit," Aldrich said, not bothering to lower his voice or acknowledge that the new Luna was sitting close enough to hear every word. "Your uncle's already made preliminary arrangements. I'd review them before you agree to anything." Kyle's attention sharpened. "He send the full proposal?" "Send it to me directly. I'll have it on your desk by morning." Serena reached for her water glass. To her left, a young she-wolf named Mira, who had been seated there as a courtesy, was watching the exchange with bright, avid eyes and the specific excitement of someone witnessing exactly what they'd expected to witness. "He sent it to the beta," Mira murmured, low and pleased. Not even through you. Serena set her glass down. Yes. Does that bother you? I'm sure there's an established system, Serena said. Mira's smile was small and satisfied. Of course. On Serena's first morning as Luna of Blackthorne territory, she woke at 5 to the sound of the pack enforcers drilling in the lower courtyard, shouts, the crack of wooden practice staffs, boots on gravel. The bedroom she'd been given was adjacent to Kyl's through a shared sitting room that had a lock on both sides. His side had been locked when she arrived. She hadn't checked it again. The room itself was large and cold and furnished in the same black and silver palette as everything else in this keep, and it had the specific atmosphere of a space nobody had slept in recently, not unwelcoming so much as indifferent. She dressed herself and went exploring. This was something she had always done in unfamiliar spaces, moved through them methodically, room by room, mapping exits and functions and the small domestic details that told you more about how a place actually ran than any formal introduction could. She had learned it from her mother, who had been a healer's assistant in a minor pack outside Ashwell, and who had survived 2 changes of alpha leadership through the same skill, watching, cataloging, and keeping her mouth shut until she understood the architecture. Serena's mother had also died at 52 with a ledger of everything she knew and nobody to tell it to. Serena kept that fact somewhere uncomfortable and close. The keep had 4 floors, a basement level used for storage, and apparently for some kind of archive, 2 courtyards and a wing at the eastern end that she was gently but pointedly told by the housekeeper, an older woman named Petra, was the family residence and not typically open to visitors during the adjustment period. "I'm the Luna," Serena said pleasantly. "What's the adjustment period for?" Petra had eyes like a bird that's learned to stay very still near cats. "Standard procedure, my lady. Once the Alpha formally introduces you to household operations, of course." "Of course," Serena agreed. "When does that usually happen?" "I wouldn't know the Alpha's schedule." "Then I'll ask him." She asked him that evening when he passed through the main hall on his way to a meeting with his enforcers. He was in full working clothes, dark tactical gear, no ceremony to it. And he slowed when he saw her sitting at the long table with a cup of tea and a map of the territory she'd found in the public library wing. "You need something," he said. Not quite a question. "I'd like to be introduced to household operations. Petra mentioned there's a standard procedure." Kyle looked at the map, then at her. Something shifted in his expression, not warmly, more the way a man looks at a calculation that doesn't come out clean. "That's usually handled in the second week." "I've been here 4 days." "I'm aware." "I'd like to understand what I'm supposed to be doing," Serena said. "What the Luna's responsibilities are in this pack. What you need." The word landed strangely in the air between them. Need, like she'd said something too personal for the context. "Talk to Aldrich," Kyle said. "He manages the administrative calendar. Your beta manages my schedule. He manages all operational scheduling. It's efficient." Serena looked at him steadily. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she filed that away. That he was aware on some level that this was an unusual answer, that he chose to give it anyway. "All right," she said. "I'll speak with Aldrich." Kale left. She turned back to the map. Aldrich Voss received her the next morning in a ground-floor office with the uncomfortable energy of a man who had been told to be courteous and was experiencing that instruction as a mild inconvenience. He was 40, or close to it, square-built, with the kind of authority that came from being unquestioned long enough that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He had not stood when she entered. She had noticed. She sat without being invited. "The Alpha mentioned you'd come," he said. "He mentioned you'd help. What do you need to know?" Serena had a small notebook. She opened it. "Who manages pack welfare, injuries, housing disputes, aid requests?" Aldrich leaned back in his chair. "Enforcement handles anything requiring intervention. Financial distributions go through my office. Who do pack members contact if they need access to those distributions?" "They submit a request. My office reviews it." "On what timeline?" "A beat." "Reasonable." "Is there a written policy?" His eyes tracked from her face to her notebook and back. "We operate on precedent." "And if a precedent doesn't cover a new situation?" "We use judgment." Serena wrote something. She did it slowly enough that he could see she was writing without being able to read it. What's my role in that process? The Luna's role is primarily ceremonial and symbolic. You represent the Alpha's household at social functions, mediate minor domestic disputes within the pack families, and serve as a point of contact for female pack members, among others. That's a narrow description. It's a traditional role. Has there been a Luna here recently? She knew there hadn't. Cale Blackthorne had been unmated for the 6 years of his reign. She was asking to see if Aldrich would lie. Not in the current administration, he said. So you've been operating without anyone in that role. We've managed. I'm sure. She closed the notebook. I'll need access to the welfare request records for the past year. Aldrich's expression did not quite change, but something behind it settled into a different shape. Those are administrative documents, sensitive. I'm the Luna. They contain personal pack member information, which would fall under my role as a contact point for pack welfare. She met his eyes. She did not look away first. I'd like them by end of week. He said he'd see what he could do. She thanked him pleasantly and left. She had the records in 2 days. She suspected it was faster than he'd intended, that something in his calculation had decided faster was better than leaving her waiting and focused. She read every page. Cale's uncle, a man named Roderick Blackthorne, who held the title of territorial steward with an authority that the organizational documents described as advisory and that the actual operational record made clear was something quite different, had his signature on 43 welfare distribution decisions in the past year. Aldrich's signature appeared on 61. The Alpha King's signature appeared on 4, all of which were large public actions: territory defense funding, alliance renewal documents, a building grant for the pack hall renovation. Serena added this to the map she was building, not on paper, in her head. She had a very good memory. Her mother had said it was a gift. Her father, who had thought carefully before saying most things, had said it was a responsibility. The first person to be genuinely unkind to her face, as opposed to the ongoing ambient unkindness of being ignored, managed, and shuffled sideways, was Kael's cousin, Dara Blackthorne, who arrived at the keep on the 9th day of Serena's residence with the proprietary ease of someone who considered the place more hers than the Luna's. Dara was 28, dark-haired like all the Blackthorns, beautiful in the cutting way that people sometimes are when they've always been told about it. She walked into the morning room where Serena was eating breakfast and reading and sat down across from her without greeting. "You're the quiet one," Dara said. Serena set down her fork. "Good morning." Kael's really committed to this. Dara's voice had the particular quality of someone thinking out loud who knows you can hear them and doesn't particularly care. I kept waiting for him to find a reason to dissolve it before the bonding. He must have run out of time. Or he made a decision. Kael doesn't make decisions like this. He makes strategic choices. Dara looked at her directly now, running an assessment so frank it almost crossed into honesty. "You're not strategic, are you?" "Depends on the strategy." "What do you want from this?" Serena thought about lying, decided it would be too easy to check. "To understand how things work here. To be useful." Dara's head tilted. "That's either very humble or very long game. Maybe I just mean it. Nobody just means anything in this house." But there was something fractionally different in Dara's voice now. Not warmth, exactly, but the edge of curiosity, like a door pushed open an inch. "My father runs this territory, has since Kael's mother died. Kael runs the military operations and the public face. That's the division." "Your father," Serena said. "Roderick." "You know who he is." "I've seen his name on documents." Dara watched her. "What documents?" "Welfare records." A silence. "You asked for those." Dara's voice had changed. The casual performance gone, something sharper under it. "Aldrich gave you those. They're part of my operational responsibility. They're administrative records. For pack welfare." Serena picked up her fork again. "Which falls under my role." Dara stood. She was good at it, the kind of standing up that managed to contain a message. "Be careful which corners you look in," she said. "Some of them have things that are hard to unsee." I appreciate the warning, Serena said. She watched Dara leave. Then she went back to her breakfast. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be. The second week brought a packed social function, a dinner for the heads of 7 allied families, the kind of event that existed to demonstrate stability and cement obligations. Serena was dressed by Petra in black, because apparently the Luna always wore black at formal functions, a detail that had not been communicated to her until 40 minutes before arrival. She was given a seat at the far end of the high table, below 2 of Roderick's sons and above nobody in particular, which placed her in a conversational dead zone that she suspected had been engineered rather than accidental. She spent the first hour eating carefully and watching. The allied family heads were a specific type, men and women who had survived long enough in their positions to have faces that revealed nothing by accident. They spoke to Kael with the particular careful deference of people who were constantly recalibrating how much of it was still strategically correct. They spoke to Roderick Blackthorne with a different quality of deference, older, more settled, the kind built up through years of smaller debts. Roderick was 63, lean in the way that some men get past 50 when their weight has been redistributed into presence. He had Kael's coloring and something of Kael's bone structure, but where Kael's face was unreadable in a way that suggested genuine internal discipline, Roderick's unreadability had the quality of performance, of a face that had learned to sit still because stillness was useful. He caught her watching him once. He smiled at her. It was a very good smile. She smiled back and turned to speak to the she-wolf beside her, who was the youngest daughter of the Harrow family and who was thrilled to have someone to talk to, and they discussed the territory's medicinal herb cultivation for 20 minutes, during which Serena learned 3 things about the eastern border region's supply chain that she filed away with everything else. After dinner, standing near the fire in the reception hall during the drinks portion that Serena suspected would last until she made herself scarce, Kael appeared beside her, not quite looking at her. Both of them faced the room. "The Harrow girl seemed to enjoy talking to you," he said. "She's very knowledgeable about herb cultivation." "You were watching my uncle." She looked at him, his profile. He was still facing the room. "Is that a problem?" "Depends what you're looking for." "I'm trying to understand how things work here. I told you that." A muscle moved in his jaw. "My uncle manages the domestic administration of this territory. He's been doing it since I took leadership. He's effective." "I don't doubt it." "Then what exactly—" "His name is on 43 welfare distributions in the past year," Serena said, keeping her voice at the pitch of pleasant party conversation. "Yours is on 4. Does that reflect how you intended the authority to be divided?" Silence. 2 beats. 3. "That's a bureaucratic question," Kael said. "Yes." "Take it up with Aldrich." "I did. He was informative." She looked back at the room. "I'm not trying to make trouble, Kael. I'm trying to understand the structure I'm part of. You're part of the Luna's role. Petra can tell you what that involves." "Petra tells me the Eastern Wing isn't available to visitors during the adjustment period." Now he looked at her. Fully, for what felt like the first time since the ceremony. His eyes were exactly as gray as they'd looked in the rain. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door they were certain was locked and aren't certain about anymore. "I'll have Petra update you," he said. He moved away into the crowd. She watched him go. She picked up her drink and finished it and thought about what she'd just seen on his face. Not suspicion, not irritation. Something that looked, if she had to name it, like discomfort, like a man hearing a frequency he hadn't expected. Good. The welfare records had given her a thread. She followed it carefully, the way you follow a loose thread in fabric, gently, not pulling, just tracking where it goes. What she found over the next 3 weeks, in the evenings when the keep was quiet, and in the hours of early morning when she was the only person in the library wing, was not a single revelation, but an accumulation, a pattern built from small discrepancies, repeated across enough documents that they stopped being explainable as errors. Territory distribution fees collected from 3 border settlements that did not appear in the PAC's formal revenue records. A welfare fund for families displaced by a border conflict 2 years prior. The fund existed in the budget, the disbursements were documented, but when Serena cross-referenced them against the request records, 7 of the families had never submitted requests. The money had been released on their behalf without their application, released to an intermediary account. Two of those families had since left the territory. One of them she found a forwarding address for, a pack in the Caldwell territory, 3 days' travel east. She wrote a letter. She said she was conducting a review of welfare administration as part of her role and wanted to confirm that the family's needs had been met. She signed it Luna Serena Blackthorne, which was the first time she had signed her name that way, and she put it in the outgoing correspondence bin herself, early enough that Petra didn't see. She also found the first reference to Kael's mother's death. It was in a 5-year-old accounting document buried in a folder labeled Administrative Restructuring, and it was not what it seemed to be. The document covered the financial reorganization of the PAC's governing authority following the death of the previous Alpha's mate, Kael's mother, Elara Blackthorne, and what it showed, if you read it alongside the corresponding security reports from the same month, was that the restructuring had been initiated before Elara died, 4 days before. Serena sat with that for a long time. The candle burned low. The keep was silent around her except for the wind off the northern ridge. She read it again. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it and made no physical note of it anywhere. She was not, at this point, afraid. Fear would be useful later, perhaps, but right now it was not the relevant tool. What she felt was something colder and more sustainable. The specific clarity of a person who has just understood how large a thing they have walked into and decided to stay. She went back to her room. She lay down in the large cold bed. She looked at the ceiling and ran through everything she knew, end to end, the way you run through a route before you have to walk it in the dark. 4 days later, Kael summoned her to his study. The summons came through Petra, which was how all formal communication in this household worked, through intermediaries, through protocol, through the small insulating layers that kept people from having to speak to each other directly. Serena had begun to think of it as a symptom. You built that many layers between yourself and your household only if direct contact felt dangerous. She went at the time specified. The study was on the 3rd floor, north-facing, with 2 walls of territory maps and a desk that looked like it had been used hard for a long time. Kael was standing when she arrived, which she read immediately as a meeting that was not going to offer her a chair. She sat down anyway, in the one near the window. Something moved across his face. He didn't comment. He sat down too. "I've been informed," he said, "that you've been accessing administrative records." "Welfare records," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because they fall within my responsibilities, and I wanted to understand them." "Aldrich tells me you've been cross-referencing them against financial documents from the archive." So Aldrich had noticed. Good to know the timeline. "That's correct." Kael's hands, flat on the desk, pressed slightly. Not quite a movement. "What are you looking for?" "Clarity." "About what?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that specific gray intensity, and she wondered if he ever used it on himself. That gaze turned inward. Or if it was purely directional, always outward, always looking for the threat in the room. "There are some irregularities in the financial records," she said. "Disbursements that don't match request documentation. Revenue that doesn't appear in the formal accounts." Silence. "Those records are complex," Kael said. "They span multiple administrative periods. Discrepancies in documentation don't necessarily indicate—" "I'm not making an accusation," Serena said. She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you what I found, because it's your territory, and you should know. My uncle manages that administration." "I know." Something tightened in his jaw. "Are you suggesting my uncle is—" "I'm suggesting you look at the records yourself. The ones from 2 years back. The Border Conflict Welfare Fund." She met his eyes. "And the restructuring documents from 5 years ago, the month your mother died." The room changed. She could feel it. A pressure shift, like the moment before a storm when the air takes on weight. Kael stood. "That's enough." "Kael, my mother died of a cardiac event. It's documented. It was reviewed by PAC healers and confirmed by the Alliance Council." His voice was level, but it had taken on something underneath the level, a vibration, the specific sound of a structure taking on stress. "I understand you're new here, and you're trying to find purchase, something to do, some way to be—" He stopped. recalibrated. But what you're describing is a serious allegation against my family based on what sounds like amateur analysis of complex documents you have no background in. Serena sat very still. She let the words land on her the way you let cold water land on you. Not absorbing it exactly, just receiving it. I have a background in administrative documentation, she said. My mother kept records for a pack healing house for 11 years. I learned from her. That's not equivalent. No, but it's not nothing. She held his gaze. I'm not your enemy, Kyle. I know you don't believe that yet, but I need you to hear this. Someone in your inner circle has been operating outside the pack's formal authority structure for years. The documentation is there. I can show you exactly. You're done. His voice came flat and final, like a door closing. Whatever project you've been running in the archive, it's done. I'll have Aldrich inform Petra to restrict access until we can properly review what you've been accessing and why. Serena stood. She was shorter than him. Right now, that fact was irrelevant. Restricting my access to pack documents won't change what the documents say. Goodbye, Serena. She left. In the corridor, she walked at a normal pace. Her hands were still. At the stairwell, she paused for a moment, one hand on the stone wall, and let the anger move through her. Not suppressing it, just not performing it, which was different. The anger was information. It told her she'd gotten close enough to matter, close enough that someone felt the need to shut a door. She went back to her room. She sat at the small writing desk by the window and looked out at the courtyard, where the training flag snapped in a cold wind. All right, she thought, then we do this differently. She had already removed nothing from the archive. She was careful about that. She had made herself careful about it from the start, because she had a mother's voice in the back of her mind saying the first thing they look for is what's missing, so never let anything go missing. Everything she'd found in place. Everything she'd understood in her head. And she had the letter she'd sent to the Caldwell territory. She had Dara's unguarded moment in the doorway. She had 43 signatures on welfare distributions. She had 4 days of administrative restructuring before a woman died. She was not finished. She was redirected. There was a difference. The next morning, she went to the eastern wing. The door was unlocked. Either they'd forgotten to address it specifically, or someone had decided that locking it now would make her more curious. Either way, it was open, and she walked through into a corridor that smelled of dust and closed rooms, and something else underneath, something older, cedar and something medicinal. Alara Blackthorne had apparently favored cedar. The rooms she found were in the state of spaces kept as they were after someone left them, and nobody could figure out what to do with that fact. A sitting room, a study with books still on the shelves, a small room at the end that appeared to have been a workroom, a large table, shelves of labeled jars and folded cloth, and instruments that suggested Kyle's mother had been, like her own mother, someone who worked with her hands at something practical. On the table, under a cloth that had been over it so long the dust had settled into it in layers, was a leather-bound ledger. Serena stood looking at it. She picked up the corner of the cloth, set it down again. She looked at the door, at the window, at the corridor beyond. Then she lifted the cloth. The ledger was old. The leather cracked at the spine, and on the inside cover, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 3 words. She read them. She read them again. She put the cloth back. For a long moment she stood in the cedar-smelling workroom of a dead woman and felt, for the first time since she'd arrived in this keep, something that was not calculation or anger or methodical patience, but something closer to the specific vertigo of a person who has just understood that what she thought was the edge of a map is actually its center. 3 words. She left the wing. She walked back to her room. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed twice. 3 times, the way you do when you need your heart to hear that you haven't made a fatal mistake. She pulled a small notebook from the inner pocket of her coat. Not the one she'd shown Aldrich, a different one, smaller, one she kept on her person. And she wrote the 3 words exactly as she'd seen them, pressing hard enough that they'd stay if the notebook got wet. Then she sat very still and thought about Kyle standing in his study telling her she was done. She thought about Roderick's smile across a dinner table. She thought about 4 days. She thought about what those 3 words implied about who had written them, and when, and whether Alara Blackthorne had known what she was documenting, or whether she'd known more than that. whether she'd known it was coming, and whether she'd hidden this ledger in this room under this cloth because she was afraid or because she was preparing. Serena pressed the notebook closed. And then, quietly, in the cold room, she understood that she had not walked into a corruption problem. She had not walked into a power struggle or a political mismanagement situation or even a garden-variety embezzlement scheme dressed up in pack authority. She had walked into a murder that everyone believed was a natural death. And the murdered woman's son, the man whose trust she could not get, whose access she had just lost, who had looked at her this morning like she was a minor operational nuisance, was the only person in this keep with both the authority to act on what she'd found and the most personal reason in the world to believe none of it was true. Down in the courtyard, the training flags cracked in the wind. She opened the notebook again. Underneath the 3 words, she wrote 4 more. He doesn't know yet. Hint. That evening, a writer arrived from the Caldwell territory. The letter was addressed to her. Petra brought it up with the particular expressionlessness of someone who has decided not to react to things until told what reaction is appropriate. Serena opened it in her room. The family she'd written to, a woman named Hadley, her husband, and 2 children, had written back in the careful, slightly formal script of someone unused to correspondence with pack nobility. They thanked the Luna for her attention. They said they were doing well in Caldwell territory, where the Voss family had arranged their relocation 2 years ago after the border incident. They said they had been grateful for the help. The Voss family. Aldrich's family. Serena read that 3 times. Then she read the rest. At the bottom of the letter, in a different hand, shakier, like someone older or someone writing quickly, were 2 lines. No name, no signature. If you are who I think you are, there are others. The archive doesn't have everything. The archive never had everything. Look for what was moved before the restructuring. The letter shook slightly in her hands. She noticed. She set it on the desk and pressed it flat and breathed. 4 days. 43 signatures. 3 words in a dead woman's ledger. A relocated family who knew Aldrich Voss's name. And something moved before the restructuring. Before Alara died. That had never made it into the record she'd been reading. She looked at the door to the shared sitting room, the lock on his side. Still, presumably, locked. She picked up the letter. She folded it and put it inside the notebook and put the notebook back in her coat. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would find what had been moved. And if Cale Blackthorne had taken away her access to the archive, then she would find another way in. The candle burned. Outside, the wind picked up, cold and purposeful, and somewhere in the lower corridors of the keep she heard, very distantly, 2 voices. Aldrich's, she was almost certain, and someone she didn't recognize, going quiet just before they reached the level where they might be heard. She sat in the dark of her room with a coat pocket full of evidence and a dead woman's handwriting behind her eyes. The man she'd married didn't believe her. His family was dangerous. His beta was compromised. And she had just, without knowing it was going to happen, received what might be the first piece of contact from someone inside this pack who also knew what she was starting to know. She was, in this keep, entirely alone. She had been in worse positions. She had been in positions where she had nothing. Right now she had a thread, a letter, a ledger, and a brain that forgot very little. She put out the candle. In the darkness she heard, very clearly, what sounded like a door in the sitting room. The lock, clicking. Not opening, just clicking. As if someone on the other side had reached for it and stopped. She did not move toward the sitting room door. That was the first decision, and she made it the way she made most decisions in this keep. Not impulsively, not out of fear, but out of a cold reading of available information. If Kyle had reached for the lock and stopped, it meant he wasn't ready. Forcing the moment would only give him a reason to be certain about her instead of uncertain, and uncertainty was more useful to her right now than any conversation she could have through a door in the dark. She lay down. She slept 4 hours, which was enough. In the morning, she went to find what had been moved before the restructuring. The problem with the archive was not access. Kyle had told Aldrich to restrict her, but restriction in a keep this size meant relying on staff compliance, and staff compliance was patchier than administrators liked to believe. The problem with the archive was that if something had been deliberately removed before Alara Blackthorne died, it would not be in the archive anymore. That was the point of moving it. So she didn't go to the archive. She went to Petra. Petra was in the linen room on the second floor, which was where she spent the first hour of most mornings, and she looked up when Serena appeared in the doorway with the particular wariness of a woman who has been doing a job a long time and knows when something is about to complicate it. "My lady." "I have a question," Serena said. She leaned against the door frame rather than entering. A small choice, but it kept the conversation from feeling like a confrontation. 5 years ago, when the administrative restructuring happened. "Were you here?" Petra's hands paused on the sheet she was folding. "I've been here 22 years. "Then you remember when they cleared out some of the record storage, moved things?" The hands started moving again. "There have been several reorganizations over the years. The one specifically before the late Luna's death." The folding stopped. Serena waited. She had learned to wait the way her mother had, not passively, not holding her breath, but the way you wait when you've asked the right question and the answer exists and you're simply allowing space for it to arrive. "I don't know anything about record movement," Petra said. "I'm not asking about the records. I'm asking if you remember things being moved, generally, in that period." Petra set down the sheet. She looked at Serena with the bird stillness she always deployed, but underneath it something else was happening. A recalculation, a weighing. "There were boxes," she said finally, "taken to the steward's residence. I assumed it was the Alpha's personal effects. Things from Lady Alara's workroom." "Roderick's residence," Serena said. "Yes." "Did they come back?" Petra looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "They didn't." Serena thanked her and left. She stood in the corridor and thought. Roderick's residence was 2 kilometers from the keep, a formal house on the territory's administrative grounds that Roderick had occupied since Kyle took over as Alpha. She had not been invited there. She had not been introduced to Roderick in any formal capacity. He had been at the dinner, he had smiled at her, and he had not since appeared in any meeting or function where she was present, which she had originally read as courtesy and was now reading as deliberate avoidance. She could not walk into Roderick's house, not directly, not yet. She needed a different angle. She found it that afternoon through the Harrow girl. Leanna Harrow was 22 and genuinely knowledgeable about herb cultivation because her family managed the territory's medicinal supply agreements, which meant they had a working relationship with every healer, herbalist, and supply runner across the pack's eastern holdings. She was also lonely in the specific way of young women placed in political proximity to power without any actual role in it, and she had responded to Serena's dinner conversation with the visible relief of someone who had been waiting to be spoken to directly. Serena found her in the keep's eastern garden, which had been laid out for medicinal herbs and was currently in early spring preparation, cold soil freshly turned. "Tell me about the supply lines," Serena said, sitting on the stone bench beside her. "The eastern routes, specifically." Leanna looked pleased. "The eastern routes go through 3 waypoints before they reach the pack healers. The main distribution hub is at Roswick, about 40 minutes east of here. Everything comes through there." "Including anything going to the steward's residence?" A brief pause. "The steward has his own supply arrangements, his household orders through a separate channel." "Through who?" "I'm not sure exactly. My father handles the agreements, and the steward's household isn't part of the main contracts." She hesitated. "There's a runner, Bren. He's been doing private runs to that residence for as long as I can remember. He's not pack exactly, contracted." "Does Bren come through the keep?" "He stops at the eastern gate, twice a week usually." Serena looked at the turned soil. "When's his next run?" Leanna looked at her with eyes that were bright and careful and older than her general affect suggested. "Are you going to tell me what you're looking for?" "Not yet," Serena said, "but when I can, I will." Something settled in Leanna's face. A decision. "Tomorrow morning, around 6th hour." She was at the eastern gate at 6th hour the next morning. The cold was sharp, the light still gray, and Brent turned out to be a compact man in his 40s with the permanent squint of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors and the watchfulness of someone who had spent a lot of time around powerful people's private business. He stopped when he saw her, looked at the gate, looked at her. "You're the Luna," he said. "Yes. Gate usually has an enforcer." "He went to get coffee," Serena said. It was true. She had timed it. "I'm not here to stop you. I just want to ask you something." Bryn's jaw moved slightly. He didn't go for the gate, but he didn't step back either. "What?" "You've been running to the steward's residence for years. What do you move?" "Supplies." "What kind?" "Whatever I'm given to move." Serena looked at him steadily. He had the kind of face that had made peace with inconvenience a long time ago. Not dishonest exactly, but practical. The kind of practical that had survived proximity to power by not asking certain questions. 5 years ago, she said. "Were you running in that period?" Something shifted behind his eyes. "You moved boxes from this keep," she said. "From the late Luna's workroom to the steward's residence." His hands on the cart handle were still. His breathing had changed. Barely, but she was watching for it. "I move what I'm hired to move," he said. "I know. I'm not saying you knew what was in them." She kept her voice even, no pressure in it, just fact. "I'm asking if you remember it." A long pause. The gray light. A bird somewhere in the keep's eaves. "There were boxes," he said, "sealed, heavy for their size." He looked past her at the gate. "I moved them. Put them in the locked room at the east end of the steward's house. Roderick Blackthorne was there when I arrived." "Was he alone?" "Aldrich Voss was with him." The air between them was very still. "Thank you," Serena said. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way people sometimes do when they've said something they can't unsay, and they're trying to read whether that was a mistake. "You're different from what they said." "What did they say?" "That you were harmless." She almost smiled. "How long ago did they say that?" "First week you were here." "And now?" Bryn picked up the cart handle. "I'm going to be late," he said. But there was something in his voice that was not hostility. She stepped aside. He went through the gate. She stood in the cold and let the information settle into her. Not reacting, not moving yet, just letting it sit where it needed to sit. Roderick and Aldrich, together, receiving sealed boxes from a dead woman's workroom 2 days before the administrative restructuring that transferred operational authority formally into Roderick's hands, not 4 days before Alara died. 2. She had the sequence wrong. She walked back to the keep. Her boots on the gravel were even and unhurried. Her heart rate was elevated, and she let it be elevated, because she had also learned that suppressing the body's warning signals was not the same as staying calm, and she needed every warning signal she had right now to stay sharp. In the main corridor, she ran into Kael, not figuratively, physically. She came around the corner from the side passage, and he was there, already dressed and clearly headed somewhere with Aldrich 2 steps behind him, and they almost collided. She stopped. He stopped. For one unguarded moment, 1 second, maybe less, something crossed his face that was not irritation or the managed blankness he usually wore around her. It was something raw, something that looked, if she'd had to name it, like relief. It was gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." Aldrich, behind him, looked at her with an expression so neutral it had weight to it. "I was checking on the Eastern Garden," she said. Let them believe what they wanted about what she'd been doing at the Eastern Gate. "The soil preparation." "The garden," Kael said, like a man filing information he hasn't decided what to do with yet. "Leanna Harrow mentioned the medicinal beds need attention. I thought I'd look." "That's fine." He said it as though he'd reached for a different word and settled for that one. "We're heading to the council room. Border report." "Of course." She moved to let them pass. Aldrich passed her without looking at her. She noticed. Kael stopped beside her. Just for a moment, not blocking her, not touching her, just pausing, close enough that she could hear him breathe. "You look tired," he said, very low. She looked up at him. "I'm fine." His jaw tightened. He moved on. She stood in the corridor and listened to their footsteps going away. And she thought about the relief on his face and about what it meant that he was carrying something, had been carrying something, that he didn't know she'd already seen the shape of. She thought, He is going to be the hardest part of this. Not because he was cruel, because he wasn't, because she was going to have to break something in him to save him, and the only way to do that was to earn enough of his trust that he'd let her close enough to do it. And right now she had approximately none of his trust, and a beta who knew she was watching, and a steward with sealed boxes and a timeline that pointed to murder and no proof she could put in KL's hands that he wouldn't immediately hand to the people who'd taken it from a dead woman's room in the first place. She needed the ledger. Not just the words on the inside cover. The ledger itself. What Ilara had recorded in it. Why she'd hidden it. Whether there was enough in it to build something unignorable. She needed to get it out of the Eastern Wing without anyone knowing it had moved. She needed 3 days. She had, she suspected, fewer than that. The confirmation came that same evening in the form of Dara Blackthorne appearing at her door after dinner with a bottle of wine and an expression that had shed most of its performance. "My father knows you spoke to the runner," Dara said. Serena stepped back to let her in. "Come in then." Dara came in. She set the wine on the small table without offering to pour it, and sat in the chair by the window and looked at Serena with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they don't entirely know what to do with. "He knows," she said again. "How fast?" Fast enough that Aldrich was at the residence by mid-morning. Dara's hands were in her lap, still. "What did the runner tell you?" "What he could." Serena sat on the edge of the bed. "What do you know, Dara?" Silence. "Not enough to do anything with," Dara said finally. The honesty of it was startling. It had the specific quality of a thing that had been held a long time and gotten heavy. "I know my father took boxes from Ilara's workroom. I know Aldrich was there. I was 15, and I saw them, and when I asked my father what they were, he told me they were personal documents that needed to be preserved correctly, and I believed him." She looked out the window. "I believed him for a long time." "When did you stop?" 2 years ago, when the Hadley family left." Her jaw was tight. "They were good people. They didn't want to leave, and they left very quickly, and afterward nobody talked about why, and Aldrich seemed satisfied." She said the word like it tasted bad. "And I started thinking about the boxes." Serena was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you put those 2 lines at the bottom of the letter? The unsigned ones?" Dara met her eyes. "Yes." Something settled. "You took a risk." "I've been not taking risks for 2 years. It hasn't made anything safer." Dara stood, moved to the window, stood with her back to the room in a way that made her easier to talk. "They're going to move against you. My father, Aldrich. The fact that you went to Bren directly, they'll read that as confirmation that you found something in the archive, something worth following outside official channels. They won't wait." "How long?" "Days, maybe less." She turned. "What did you find?" "In the archive." Serena looked at her. Dara Blackthorne, who had spent 2 years sitting on something dangerous and alone, who had written 2 unsigned lines to a woman she didn't know because not knowing had become worse than the risk, who was standing in her room right now with wine she hadn't poured because it wasn't actually a social call and they both knew it. "I found enough," Serena said. "And there's more, in the Eastern Wing." Dara's expression changed. "Ilara's workroom." "Yes." A pause. "Does Kael know about this?" "He knows I've been looking. He told me to stop." Serena held her gaze. "He won't listen to me yet." "Not about his family." "No." Dara's voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone who knows a specific person well. "He won't. Not from you. Maybe not from anyone." "Then I need to have something he can't dismiss," Serena said. "Something complete enough that dismissing it would require actively choosing not to see." Dara was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need?" "I need to move something from Ilara's workroom without anyone knowing it moved." Serena stood. "And I need time I may not have." Dara looked at her, a full, unguarded look, the kind that meant she was making a decision she knew she couldn't unmake. Her breathing was controlled but not effortless. "I can give you a night," she said. "I can arrange for my father to be occupied tomorrow evening. A message about territory business from the north. He'll go in person, he always does. Aldrich will be with him." "That gives me the keep clear for a few hours." "And I'll go with you," Dara said. To the workroom. Whatever's there, I want to see it. You understand what it might mean, Serena said, if what I think is in that ledger is there. I understand what my father did, Dara said, and her voice was level and controlled, and underneath it something was burning that she had been keeping at a careful distance for 2 years. I've understood it for a while. I just didn't have anywhere to take it. She looked at Serena directly. Now I do. The wine sat unopened on the table between them. Tomorrow night, Serena said. Tomorrow night, Dara agreed. After she left, Serena sat for a long time in the quiet of the room. The locked door between her and Kael's apartments was still. She thought about what it would mean for him, not abstractly, not as a strategic consideration, but actually. What it would mean for a man who had spent 6 years ruling a territory he believed his family had handed him honestly, to understand that his mother had not died of a cardiac event, that she had been removed, that the authority he'd built his identity around had been salted with blood before he ever got to it. She thought, that is a thing a person doesn't come back from the same way. She thought, I am going to show it to him anyway, because the alternative was letting it stay buried, and buried things metastasized. She had watched what buried things did to packs, to families, to the quiet wolves who filed welfare requests that nobody processed and relocated families that nobody talked about. She had watched what silence cost. She was done with the cost of silence. She lay down. Outside, the wind had picked up, cold and straight off the northern ridge, and somewhere in the keep she heard a door close. Not the sitting room door, something lower, something on the ground floor, closing quickly at an hour when most doors had already closed for the night. She lay still and listened. Footsteps. 2 sets, maybe 3, moving through the lower corridor with the specific purpose of people who were not going somewhere routine. She was on her feet in 4 seconds, boots in hand, at her own door in 6. The corridor was empty. The footsteps were already below. She stood at the top of the stairwell and heard, very clearly, Aldrich Voss's voice from somewhere near the archive level, low and stripped of its usual managed authority, taut, like a wire pulled past its test weight. We don't have days, he said. We move tonight. And then another voice, Roderick Blackthorne's, smooth and final as a door ceiling. Then tonight it is. She did not go back to her room. That was the only clear thought she had in the first 3 seconds. Not a plan, not a strategy, just the bone-level certainty that going back to her room was the same as waiting to be managed, and she was done being managed. She pressed herself flat against the stairwell wall and listened to the footsteps below disperse, 2 sets moving east toward the archive. 1 set, heavier, deliberate, moving toward the main corridor that connected the keep's interior to the eastern wing. Roderick. He was going to the workroom tonight. Not tomorrow, not in days. Tonight. She moved. Not toward the eastern wing. She wasn't fast enough for that. Not ahead of him, not without being seen. She moved laterally through the second-floor passage that ran above the main corridor, the one she'd mapped in her second week here when she'd had nothing but time and the need to understand the architecture. She moved without a candle, one hand on the stone wall, her boots quiet on the flagging, and she thought about the ledger under the cloth on the work table with the particular focus of a person who has just understood that the thing they need most is also the thing about to disappear. She reached the upper entrance to the eastern wing in 4 minutes. The door was unlocked. Had always been unlocked from this approach. She'd checked it twice. She slipped through. The wing was dark and cold and smelled of cedar and dust and time. She knew the layout now, had walked it 3 times since finding the workroom. She moved to the end of the corridor, pressed the workroom door open, and stopped. The room was empty. The cloth was on the table. The cloth was flat. She crossed to it in 3 steps and lifted it with both hands. The ledger was gone. She stood holding the cloth in the dark, and the full weight of it landed on her. Not panic, not yet, because panic would cost her seconds she didn't have, but something adjacent to it, something with teeth. She had been 1 step behind this from the moment she'd walked into this keep, and she was still 1 step behind it, and the ledger was gone, and Roderick was somewhere in this wing right now. She put the cloth down. She looked at the shelf to the left of the tables, the one with labeled jars and folded cloth, and the small instrument she'd cataloged on her first visit. Her eyes moved fast and stopped. The third jar from the left. The one she'd noted because the label was in a different handwriting from the others, older and more careful. It had been flush with the shelf edge on her previous visits. It was set back 3 inches. She crossed to it, picked it up, set it aside. Behind it, pressed flat against the back wall of the shelf, was a folded paper. Not the ledger. Something smaller, older, the paper brittle at the edges. She opened it with both hands, carefully, in the dark, and tilted it toward the faint gray light from the window. It was a letter. 2 pages, dense writing, the same hand as the ledger's inside cover. She read the first paragraph and felt the floor shift under her. She folded it, put it in her coat, replaced the jar, left the room. She was halfway down the corridor when the door at the far end opened and Roderick Blackthorne walked in carrying a candle. They saw each other at the same moment. The corridor was 15 feet long. He was at one end. She was closer to the middle. The candle lit his face from below, which made the angles of it harder, that managed, deliberate face that she'd been reading for weeks, and for once the management had slipped. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him before. Genuine surprise gone in under 2 seconds, replaced by something that functioned like warmth and was as warm as a blade. "Luna Serena," he said. "You're up late." "So are you," she said. He moved toward her, unhurried. He had a key in his other hand. Old iron, substantial. "I come here sometimes," he said, "to remember Elara. This was her space. I find comfort in it." He tilted his head slightly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I was exploring," she said, "at this hour. I have trouble sleeping." He stopped 6 feet from her, the candle between them. His eyes moved over her face with the specific attention of a man who has been reading people for a very long time and is very good at it. "You've been busy since you arrived," he said. "Archive records, the runner, the Harrow girl." Each item landed with the flat weight of a man who knows he's been watching and is no longer pretending otherwise. "You're curious about how things work here. The Luna should understand the territory she's part of." Of course. His smile was the same one he'd given her across the dinner table, and she understood now that it was not a friendly smile. It was a functional one, a tool deployed to fill the space where a threat would otherwise be visible. "I've been meaning to speak with you, actually, to offer some guidance, since Kyle is occupied with military matters and you're still finding your footing." "That's generous," she said. "We want you to succeed here," he said. "The family. We want this bond to work. Kale needs stability." He paused. "Which is why it concerns me to hear that you've been reaching into areas that are more complex than they appear. Documents with history behind them, relationships and decisions that go back years before you arrived." Another pause. "It's easy to misread context when you're new. What context am I missing?" "The ledger you found in Elara's workroom," he said. The corridor was very quiet. "Was that what you came for tonight?" she said. "I came for the same reason I always come." His voice was even and comfortable, the voice of a man who has been comfortable in power long enough that discomfort no longer registers as a real possibility. "But yes, I noticed someone had been in the workroom. The cloth was moved." His eyes stayed on her face. Elara kept a ledger for personal notes, correspondence, things she was working through toward the end. "It's a private document. Family." "Then I'll leave it to the family," she said. "I appreciate that." He moved a step past her toward the workroom. Then he stopped, very close to her now, and lowered his voice to something that was almost intimate. "Serena, you seem like an intelligent woman, genuinely. And intelligence in this position is a quality Kael needs, even if he doesn't know it yet." His eyes were level and direct and completely without warmth. But intelligence deployed carelessly, against the wrong structures, is the kind of thing that ends badly for everyone, including the people who think they're protected by their position. She looked at him. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd been building for weeks. Not aggression, because aggression was information she couldn't afford to give him, but not retreat either. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "Good." He stepped past her. "Sleep well." She walked back through the dark corridor and up the main stairs and into her room, and she sat on the bed and she pressed the folded paper against her sternum with both hands and breathed. The letter was still there. That was what she had. He'd come for the ledger, already retrieved it, or never needed it tonight. She didn't know which. But he hadn't found the letter because he hadn't known to look behind the jar, and she hadn't given him any indication she'd found it. She opened it again, read it all the way through this time. It was dated 8 days before Alara Blackthorne's death. It was addressed to a man named Serena Vale, her father's older brother, a council member in the Western Territories who had died 3 years ago. The letter was from Alara, and it was methodical and specific and written with the particular clarity of a woman who was writing because she understood she might not have another chance. It documented 4 things: that Roderick had been systematically redirecting PAC revenue for 6 years, using Aldrich Voss as the operational arm; that 3 PAC members had been killed in what was reported as a border conflict 2 years prior, but was in fact orchestrated to remove them. They had discovered the revenue diversion and intended to bring it to the council. That Roderick had made arrangements, she did not say how she knew, only that she knew, to ensure she would not be able to speak at the upcoming Alliance gathering, and that she had given copies of her financial documentation to 2 people, Serena Vale himself, and one other whose name she had not written out but had described in enough detail that Serena, reading it twice in the cold of her room, felt the breath leave her body. The second copy had been given to someone inside Kael's own household, someone Alara had trusted, someone who would know when the time was right to use it, and whose name Alara had not written down to protect. She sat with that for a long time. The candle burned. Her hands were steady, which was interesting because the rest of her was not particularly steady. Her pulse was elevated, and there was a specific tightness in her chest that was not fear, not exactly, but was the physical register of a person who has just understood that what she thought was the shape of this problem was still a smaller version of its actual shape. Someone in this keep had held Alara's documentation for 5 years, had waited, had not used it, or had been unable to, or had been stopped, or was still waiting for the right moment, or had been turned. She put the letter back in her coat, lay down without undressing, looked at the ceiling. In the morning, she needed to talk to Dara. She did not sleep. At 5th hour, she heard the sitting room door. Not the click of a lock this time, the actual movement of a handle, and then Kael's voice, low and taut, coming through the gap. "Serena." She was already sitting up. "Yes." A pause. "Can I come in?" It was not quite a question. She got up and opened the door from her side. He was dressed, barely, shirt unlaced at the collar, no jacket, like he'd come directly from being awake somewhere else. His hair was undone. There were shadows under his eyes that had the specific quality of hours rather than days, the kind that said he hadn't slept tonight and possibly not the night before. He looked at her, then at the room, then at her coat still on the chair by the bed. "You were out tonight," he said. "Yes. My uncle came to see me an hour ago." His voice was controlled with visible effort, the control you employ when what's underneath it is large enough that letting any of it out risks losing the structure entirely. "He told me you've been accessing areas of the keep that aren't part of your designated role, that you've been questioning contracted workers, that you've been building something, a case, he called it, against his administration." She waited. "He said he found you in the Eastern Wing tonight." Kael's jaw was tight. His eyes on her were the most direct they'd ever been. Not cold, not managed. Stripped. "Alara's workroom." "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because there was something there I needed to see." "What?" She reached into her coat and took out the letter. She held it out to him. He looked at it. He didn't take it immediately. She could see him weighing it, weighing her, some part of him knowing that taking the letter was a one-way door. He took it, he read it. She watched his face. She watched it the way she'd been watching faces in this keep for weeks. Carefully, completely. Not looking for what she wanted to see, but for what was actually there. She watched him read his mother's handwriting, his mother's words, the specific clinical precision of a woman documenting her own death before it happened. She watched his jaw set, and his hand tighten on the paper, and the color leave his face in a way that wasn't dramatic, wasn't performed, was just the physiological fact of blood retreating from the surface when the core needs it. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the small table between them and stood with both hands pressed flat on the surface, and his head dropped for a moment, just a moment, and she saw his shoulders work against something. "She wrote this 8 days before she died," he said. "Yes." "She sent it to Corin Vale. And one other person. Someone inside this household." She kept her voice even. "She didn't name them, to protect them." His head came up. "Who?" "I don't know yet." The silence was dense. She could feel it pressing against the walls of the small room. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of too much happening at the same speed. "This could be fabricated," he said. "My uncle could have. I found it behind a jar on the shelf in your mother's workroom. Hidden. Your uncle didn't know it was there, Yeen. He came tonight for something else. He didn't look for it." She held his gaze. "The handwriting matches the inscription in the ledger on the inside cover, the one he came to retrieve tonight. Can you get that ledger from him?" Kyle looked at her. "Can you demand it?" she said. "As Alpha? As the person with authority over this territory and everything in it?" Something moved across his face. The specific look of a man who is testing a door he's never tested before and doesn't know if it opens from his side. "I thought I had authority over this territory," he said, and his voice was very quiet and had something underneath it that was the oldest kind of pain, the kind that comes not from a new wound, but from understanding that an old one was never what you thought it was. "You do," she said, "but you've never used it in his direction. He's family." "I know." He picked up the letter, set it down again. His hands on the table were not quite still. "Everything I've built here," he said, not to her specifically, to the room, to the letter. "The alliances, the territory agreements, the way this pack runs, all of it was built by you," Serena said. "What your uncle did before and underneath it doesn't unmake what you've done." He looked at her. She saw the question in it. "Why are you giving me that? Why soften it?" And she answered it honestly before he asked. "Because I need you functional," she said. "Not because it isn't devastating. It is. But if you collapse into it right now, tonight, the people who built this situation win." His eyes stayed on her. "You've been building this case for weeks. Since the first day. Why?" "Because I could see it," she said. "And because—" She stopped, chose the honest version instead of the careful version. "Because this is my pack now, whether or not anyone here wants to accept that, and you don't let something like this rot in your own house." The room was still for a long moment. Then Dara's voice came from the corridor, quiet, urgent, wrong, the specific wrong of someone who has moved fast and is trying not to show it. "Kyle!" A knock. "Kyle, open the door." He moved, opened it. Dara came in, and her face was the face of someone who has just run out of time. She looked at Kyle, then at Serena, then at the letter on the table, and something collapsed in her expression. Not relief exactly, more like the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a shape that no longer fits. "He's called an emergency meeting," she said. "My father, Aldrich, and the senior enforcers, in the council room. Now." She looked at Kyle. "He's going to move against Serena tonight. Frame it as a breach of pact security, unauthorized access to sensitive documents, interference with administrative operations." Her voice was controlled and very tired. "He's been preparing this for weeks. Since before she arrived, I think. In case she turned out to be this." Kyle went very still. "He drafted a formal petition," Dara said, "for the council to remove her from the Luna position on grounds of conduct detrimental to pact stability. He needs a majority of senior enforcers to ratify it. He has 5 of the 7 already committed." 5 of the 7 enforcers. The men who ran the military and physical authority of this territory, committed to Roderick. Serena felt it then, not fear, but the close cousin of it, the one that lives in your chest and tells you the architecture of the situation has shifted and you are now standing in a different building than the one you walked into. She had spent weeks being careful, methodical, patient, and it had not been enough because she had been thinking about evidence and Roderick had been thinking about votes, and those were not the same game. "How long?" she said. The meeting starts in 20 minutes, Dara said. He wanted it done before morning, before you could... She looked at the letter on the table, at Kael's face. Before any of this. 20 minutes. Serena looked at Kael. He was looking at the letter. She could see him processing. Not slowly, Kael Blackthorne was not a slow thinker, but the volume of what he was processing was large, and the timeline was impossible, and she could see him, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely unsure of which direction to move. That was the moment she understood what she had to do. Not the careful thing, not the patient thing, not the version where she continued to build the case quietly until it was unassailable. That path had just closed. Roderick had read her correctly, had understood exactly what she was doing, and had moved to cut it off before it was complete. And he had done it in the smartest possible way. Not through violence or confrontation, but through institutional process, through the structures of pack governance that existed to create legitimacy and could just as easily be used to destroy it. She could not outpatient this anymore. She could not outcareful it. She picked up the letter from the table. She looked at Kael. How many of the allied family heads are still in the territory from the last gathering? She said. He blinked, refocused. 3. The Harrows, the Vessin family, and Elder Morwick. Can you get them to the main hall in 20 minutes? I can get them there if I tell them the Alpha requires their presence. Then do that. She looked at Dara. The documentation from the archive, the welfare disbursements, the revenue discrepancies, can you get to it before Aldrich locks down the archive? I know where it is, Dara said. Her voice had changed, the exhaustion still there, but something else under it now, something that had been waiting 2 years for a direction. I can get it. Get it and bring it to the main hall. Serena looked at both of them. Everything. Whatever you can carry. Kael said, What are you going to do? She held the letter. She felt the weight of it. Not the paper, but everything it represented. 5 years of a dead woman's truth, sitting in a jar on a shelf, waiting for someone to know where to look. I'm going to make sure your uncle can't run this as an administrative process, she said. He wants a private council vote in a back room, so I'm going to make it public. Kael looked at her for a moment that was longer than a moment. The specific look of a man who has seen someone clearly for the first time and is not entirely sure how to hold what he sees. If you walk into that hall tonight, he said, with all of this, and it isn't enough. I know, she said. They'll exile you, at minimum. I know. Another beat. His jaw was set and his eyes were on her, and for the first time since the ceremony in the rain, he was fully, completely present in a room with her. No managed distance, no looking past her left shoulder. Then we'd better make it enough, he said. She put the letter in her coat and moved to the door. Behind her, she heard him follow. The main hall at 5th Hour looked nothing like it did for formal functions. No torches arranged for ceremony, no tables draped in black and silver, no staff placed strategically to manage the impression of order. The torches were lit because Serena had asked Petra to light them, and Petra had done it without asking why, which was the first time Serena had felt the housekeeper's weight shift in her direction. The hall was raw in the high torchlight, stone and timber, and the smell of old smoke, and the particular cold of a large room that hasn't been filled with people yet. It would be filled soon. Kael had sent runners. Serena stood at the center of the hall's main floor. Not at the high table, not elevated, the exact center, and she laid out what Dara had brought from the archive on the long table nearest the fire. 43 disbursement records, 17 financial ledger pages with Aldrich's notations, the correspondence log showing which communications had bypassed the Alpha's desk and gone directly to Roderick, the welfare fund documentation with the 7 ghost families, names, amounts released, request records that didn't exist. She arranged them in order, methodically, the way her mother had arranged instruments before a complicated procedure, everything where it would be needed, nothing where it would get in the way. Dara stood at the table's edge watching her. She hadn't spoken since the keep corridor. She had the look of someone who had been running towards something for a long time and had just arrived and wasn't sure yet if arriving felt like relief or like falling. He'll come in here and deny everything, Dara said. Yes. My father is very good at denial. He's been doing it for 30 years, and he's never once looked like he was lying. She paused. Not even to me. I know. Serena set the last document down. That's why the documents matter more than what he says. Documents can be challenged. Provenance, context, interpretation. Which is why the witnesses matter more than the documents. Serena looked at her. Who's the longest-serving enforcer in this pack? Not in rank. In years. Dara thought. Garrett. He's been here since before Kael's father died. He was Alara's personal security lead. Is he one of the 5 committed to Roderick's vote? No, he's one of the 2 who weren't approached. Her eyes sharpened. Why weren't they approached? Because Roderick knew they wouldn't commit, Serena said, which means Garrett knows something. Or Roderick is afraid of what he knows. She looked at the door. Where is he now? Probably the South Barracks. He keeps late hours. Get him, Serena said. Tell him the Alpha needs him in the main hall. Don't tell him why. Dara moved. The Allied family heads arrived in pieces. Elder Morwick first, 70 years old and sharp-eyed above a gray beard, wrapped in a heavy robe and showing no particular surprise at being summoned before dawn. Only the careful attention of a man who had survived enough surprises to have stopped being undone by them. Then the Vicene Patriarch, a broad woman named Calla Vesson, who ran a border territory with 3,000 pack members, and who looked at the documents on the table with the measuring focus of someone who managed accounts for a living. Then Leanna's father, Edric Harrow, who came in with his daughter close behind him because Leanna had apparently decided that this was a night to position herself where the information was. Kael stood at the far end of the hall near the main doors with 2 enforcers at his back. The 2 Roderick hadn't approached. He was watching the room with the expression of a man who has made a decision he can't fully trace the edges of yet and is in the process of learning to live with that. He had not spoken to Serena since the corridor, but every few minutes his eyes found her across the hall, and they held for a moment and then moved on. Garrett arrived with Dara. He was older than Serena had expected, mid-60s, a compact man who had lost the bulk of his enforcement years and kept the posture. He came in and looked at Kael first, a direct look that had something in it older than the current chain of command. Then he looked at Serena. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but something in it settled, like a key finding a lock it was made for. Luna, he said. Garrett. She moved to him, keeping her voice low. You were Alara's security lead. For 9 years. When she died, you were removed from the role. Reassigned. The single word held a filing cabinet's worth of judgment, compressed into 2 syllables and left there. Who reassigned you? Aldrich Voss, on the steward's instruction, 3 days after Lady Alara passed. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Alara's letter in Serena's hand. Something shifted in his face. Old grief, specific and real, the kind that doesn't perform itself. That the letter she sent to the Western Council member? Serena's breath stopped. You knew about it. She told me she'd sent it the morning before. His jaw worked. I spent 5 years waiting to be wrong about what I thought happened. I never got there. He looked at Kael across the hall. A long, complicated look. He couldn't hear it. I tried once in the first year. He was 26, and he just buried his mother and inherited a war on his eastern border, and I sat him down and told him I had concerns about the official account, and he stopped. He heard what he could hear. He'll hear it now, Serena said, but I need you in this room when he does. I've been in this pack for 38 years, Garrett said. I'm not leaving. She heard them before she saw them. Roderick Blackthorne came through the main hall doors with Aldrich on his left, and 5 of the 7 senior enforcers behind him, and the sound of 7 sets of boots on stone in that configuration was a specific sound, not quite military, but built to evoke it, built to arrive in a room and change what the room felt like. Roderick stopped when he saw the hall, took it in, the documents on the table, the Allied family heads, Garrett standing near Serena, Kael at the far end. His face went through something in about 1 second that Serena watched carefully. Surprise, calculation, and then the smooth return of management, faster than most people could have managed it. He was good. She had known he was good. She had built her entire approach around the fact that he was very good, and that good wasn't the same as unassailable. Kael, he said, moving his attention past Serena as though she were furniture. What's happening here? Kael said. My uncle. That was all. Just the address, flat and deliberate, and in it something that Roderick clearly heard because he stopped moving forward. We had a council meeting scheduled, Roderick said. A private matter of pact security. I moved it, Kael said. Here. This isn't the appropriate venue for... Tell me where you were tonight, Kael said. The hall went quiet. The specific quiet of a room full of people who have all understood simultaneously that what they are watching has shifted categories. Roderick's eyes moved, briefly, too briefly for most people, but Serena was watching for it, to the documents on the table, to Garrett, back to Kael. I was at the keep, he said. As I often am. In the eastern wing, Serena said. He looked at her then. She held it. In the torchlight, his face was all controlled surfaces, not a single angle offering anything, and she thought about Alara writing a letter 8 days before she died with the same careful precision that Serena was using right now, and she thought about how long a thing could be true before someone finally said it in a room where it couldn't be unsaid. Alara's workroom, she said. You went for the ledger. I don't think you should be the one leading this conversation. He addressed Kael, not her. She has been systematically interfering with PAC administration since her arrival. She has no authority over territory records, over contracted workers, over any of this. She's the Luna, Garrett said. Roderick looked at him. Garrett! She's the Luna, Garrett said again. Same tone, no escalation, just the word placed twice like a stone set twice to make sure it was level. You don't talk past her in this hall. A beat. Aldrich shifted. One of the 5 enforcers behind Roderick moved his weight to his forward foot, and Serena clocked it. Not aggression, not yet, but readiness, which was the preparation for aggression. Calavicen had picked up the first disbursement record from the table. She was reading it with the focused attention of a woman who knows what accounts should look like and is identifying what this one doesn't have. Elder Morwick had moved to stand beside her. Edric Harrow was already on his second page. These are internal PAC documents, Aldrich said sharply. They're not for external review. I'm a council elder, Morwick said without looking up. Everything in this hall is for my review. Aldrich looked at Roderick. Kael walked forward. Not fast, deliberate, the pace of someone who has decided to cover ground and doesn't need to signal it. He walked from the far end of the hall to the center of it, past the table, past Serena, and he stopped in front of his uncle with 6 feet of stone floor between them and looked at him with eyes that had lost, somewhere between the corridor and this moment, whatever managed distance they usually maintained. She sent a letter, Kael said, to Corin Vale, 8 days before she died. Roderick said nothing. She documented what you'd been doing to the revenue accounts, the 3 PAC members who died in the border conflict. Kael's voice was level with visible effort, the level of a man pressing hard on something to keep it from moving. She documented that she believed you intended to prevent her from speaking at the Alliance gathering. Alara was ill, Roderick said. In the last months she was... Don't! The word came out of Kael with a texture Serena had not heard from him before. Not loud, not cracked, just final. The finality of something hitting bedrock. Don't tell me she was confused. Don't tell me she misunderstood. I watched you at her funeral. I watched you at 26 years old, and I needed... He stopped. Something moved across his jaw. He pulled it back. I need you to tell me what you did. Wait, asasuimas. I've spent 6 years managing this territory's administration, Roderick said, and his voice had shifted too. Harder now. The warmth tool put away, something older and more load-bearing underneath it. 6 years keeping the finances stable, the alliances intact, the council relationships functional, while you ran military operations and earned your reputation in the field. You think that administration runs on goodwill? You think the compromises that keep a territory this size operational are clean? His eyes were steady and direct and completely without remorse, which was somehow worse than rage would have been. Alara didn't understand the scope of what it takes. She saw numbers that concerned her and she panicked, and she started talking to people she shouldn't have talked to, and I made decisions to protect the territory." "Which people?" Kael said. "The three border, which people?" The hall held its breath. Calavisin had stopped reading. Garrett's hands at his sides were very still. Lyanna Harrow had gone white. Roderick looked at his nephew. Something passed across his face that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of recognition. In Roderick, it resolved into something else. The look of a man who has always won by controlling the frame and is recalculating whether the frame can still be controlled. "Aldrich," he said. It was not an answer. It was an instruction. Aldrich moved, fast for a man his size, directly toward the documents table, and two of the 5 enforcers behind Roderick moved with him, not toward Aldrich but toward the doors, toward the positioning that cut off the room's exits, and in the half-second between Roderick's word and everyone's movement, Serena understood that this was not improvised. This was a contingency. Roderick had known this moment might happen and had prepared for it, had briefed them, had run the room as a game board from the moment he walked in. She picked up Alara's letter and held it. Kyle turned and his body shifted in the way bodies shift before physical action. Weight forward, shoulders, the decision running through him before it reached his face. And she said his name. Just that. He stopped. "Don't," she said. Her voice carried in the stone hall. She wasn't talking loud. She didn't need to. That's what he wants. He wants this to be a fight. A physical confrontation that he can frame as you losing control, compromising your judgment, acting on unverified information brought to you by a Luna who's been interfering with PAC administration for weeks. Aldrich's hand was on the documents. "Aldrich," Morrick said, and the single word had in it the full weight of a council elder who has been in this PAC longer than Aldrich had been alive. "Take your hand off those records." Aldrich looked at Roderick. "Those records," Morwick said, "are now under council review. Remove your hand or I will have you removed from this hall, and that will be the most consequential decision you have made in your entire career." The hand came off the documents. Garrett was already moving, not toward Aldrich, toward the 2 enforcers at the doors, and he said something to them low and direct, and Serena watched their faces and watched the moment when they made the calculation that most people in positions of power eventually face, the person who gave you your current instructions, or the person who will determine the meaning of those instructions for the rest of your career. Both of them stepped back from the doors. Roderick looked at the room. Serena watched him do it, watched him read every face, calculate every number, run the updated inventory of who was where and what they'd do, and what could still be salvaged from this architecture. She watched him understand, in something under a second, that the room had tipped. Not dramatically, not violently, but structurally and completely, the way a physical balance tips when the last small weight is placed, not falling, just crossed over, irretrievably on the other side. He looked at Kael. "You'll need me," he said. He said it with remarkable steadiness, the steadiness of a man who has always understood that the only currency that survives a collapse is information. The alliance relationships, the council members I've cultivated for 6 years, the Eastern supply arrangements, the border negotiations, none of that exists without my involvement, and none of your enforcers or your Luna, the word landed with a specific edge, knows how to manage it. You remove me from this territory's administration, and you lose half the operational structure that keeps 40,000 wolves stable. Kael looked at him for a long time. Serena felt it, the pull of it, the terrible practical weight of what Roderick was saying, which was not wrong, which was the most dangerous kind of argument because the leverage in it was real. 6 years of cultivated relationships, of brokered deals, of the unglamorous administrative work that kept large territories from fragmenting. It was real. Roderick had done it effectively, and had done it while stealing from the pack and killing people who noticed and removing a woman who tried to speak. And the fact that he had also kept the lights on did not cancel what he'd done, but it complicated the cost of what came next. She watched Kael sit with that, watched him hold the actual weight of it instead of looking past it. And she thought, not for the first time tonight, not for the last, that the thing she had understood about him from the corridor, from the stripped look on his face when he took the letter, was that whatever he was going to be at the end of this night, it was not the same as what he'd been at the start of it. Some things, once understood, could not be unlearned. Some weights, once lifted, could not be set down again without knowing what they actually were. Kala, Kael said. Vesin looked up from the documents. Alpha. The Vesin territory has managed its own eastern supply chain for 15 years without Blackthorne administrative support. Is that accurate? Kala looked at him steadily. It is. And the Harrow family manages medicinal supply agreements across 4 territories. 5, Edric Harrow said. Morwick. Kael looked at the elder. How many pact territories have rebuilt administrative structures after corruption findings in the last 20 years? Morwick said, 6 that I know of. All of them are still standing. Kael turned back to Roderick. You built something that can't survive without you, he said. That's not strength, that's a siege. His voice had gone quiet. Not soft, quiet, the way a blade is quiet. You made yourself indispensable by making everything else dependent. I understand now why the welfare requests went through you, why the council relationships ran through you, why every financial arrangement in this territory required your approval. It wasn't efficiency. He looked at his uncle, his mother's brother-in-law, the man who had stood at his father's shoulder and then at his own, the man who had received boxes from a dead woman's room and built a throne room out of them. It was the structure of a man making sure the exits all opened on his side. Roderick's face did something then, not collapse. Roderick Blackthorne was not built for collapse. But something beneath the architecture of it shifted, some load-bearing belief about how this night would go, and the face above it changed accordingly. Not by much, but enough. You're making a decision you can't reverse, he said. I know, Kael said. The Eastern alliances will be rebuilt. The border negotiations will be renegotiated. By who? Roderick's voice sharpened. By her? His eyes cut to Serena, the first time he had looked at her directly since walking into the hall, and the look was specific. Not rage, not contempt. Something worse. Recognition. The look of a man who has understood finally and completely what has been standing in the room with him for weeks. A woman who has been here 6 weeks, who has no pack history, no alliance relationships, who found what you had buried, Garrett said. His voice was thick with something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was the specific quality of a man who has waited a long time to say a true thing in a room where it could be heard. Who found it and stood in this hall at 5th hour and didn't run? Roderick looked at him. Lady Alara would have liked her, Garrett said. I think that's the most useful thing I can tell you. The hall was very still. Aldrich said, Roderick. Low. Warning. His eyes were on the 2 enforcers who had stepped back from the doors, and on Garrett, and on the rough math of the room. Roderick made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite anything. He looked at Kael one more time. A look that Serena read as the last inventory. The final accounting of a man calculating whether any version of tonight still ends in his favor, and arriving at the answer. Then he moved. Not toward the door. Toward Serena. He moved fast, faster than she'd expected from a man his age, faster than the room expected, because the room had settled into the assumption that the confrontation was verbal, and assumptions are where fast men make their moves, and his hand was on her arm, and her back hit the edge of the documents table, and the letter was in his hand before anyone else in the hall had fully processed that he'd moved at all. You want the truth? He said. His voice was low and close and completely composed. I'll give you the truth. In front of all of them. He held up the letter. Alara Blackthorne was going to destroy this pack. Not deliberately. She was going to walk into an alliance gathering and light a fire in the middle of everything we'd built because she found numbers she didn't understand and drew conclusions she couldn't verify, and she was going to burn 6 years of work and 40,000 wolves' stability to feel righteous about it. His eyes were on Kael, not on Serena. So yes, I made a decision, and I would make it again. The air in the hall did something that was not sound and not movement, but was both at the same time. Kael crossed the floor. He moved the way large men move when they have stopped managing themselves. Not fast, not slow, just directly, the direction being the only thing that existed. And he reached his uncle and took the letter from his hand with a grip that did not require force, because the alternative to releasing it was not something Roderick's hand was willing to process. And he stepped back one step, and he was breathing hard through his nose, the breath of someone holding an enormous thing very carefully. He looked at the letter, he looked at his uncle, and Serena saw the moment, the exact specific moment, when Cale Blackthorne stopped being the man who had been ruling this territory for 6 years and became something else. Something that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago, or perhaps had existed and had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for this specific room and this specific truth, and the woman who had walked into it and built this night out of documents and patience and a willingness to lose everything. If losing everything was what the truth required. He said, "Aldrich Voss, Roderick Blackthorne, you are under PAC authority arrest pending full counsel review." Aldrich moved for the door. Garrett was already there, and in the half-second before Aldrich reached him and the hall erupted into motion, enforcers moving, Roderick turning, voices breaking the silence in every direction. Serena looked at Kyle across the room, and he looked at her, and in that look was something that had not been in any room between them before tonight. Not gratitude, not relief. Something that would take longer than this night to name. Then the hall was in motion, and the night broke open around them, and the Blackthorne Empire began, in the noise and the torchlight and the cold smell of old stone, to crack at every seam they'd left unexamined for 6 years. And the question of what would be built in the space where it broke was still, in that last half-second of the night's stillness, completely open. Aldrich did not get through the door. Garrett had 38 years in this pack, and the specific advantage of a man who had spent the last 5 of them waiting for a night exactly like this one, and he put himself in the gap between Aldrich and the exit with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already run the numbers and knows how they come out. The 2 enforcers who had stepped back from the doors came forward again, and they did it on their own, without being told, which was the detail Serena would remember longest from that moment, that the choice had already been made in them before anyone gave an order, that the room had shifted and they had shifted with it. Aldrich stopped. He looked at Garrett. He looked at the enforcers. He looked at Roderick. Roderick was standing very still in the center of the hall, with Kyle 6 feet away and the documents table to his left, and the allied family heads arranged behind it, in a line that had the unintended quality of a council already in session. He looked like a man who has spent his entire life in rooms and has just understood for the first time that a room can close. "This isn't finished," Roderick said. "No," KL said. "It isn't. But you are." The enforcers came forward. Aldrich went without physical resistance. Not cooperation, exactly, more the calculated retreat of a man who was already running a different set of numbers, the ones about what he could offer in exchange for what came next. Roderick allowed himself to be positioned toward the side door that led to the PAC's holding rooms, with the bearing of a man who had decided that dignity was the last thing he could keep, and was keeping it. At the door he stopped, not toward Kyle, toward Serena. "You have no idea," he said, "what you've just opened." "Tell me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that long reading look, the last inventory of a man who has spent his life cataloging what people were made of and using it. She held it without flinching, without performing anything, just standing in it the way you stand in cold water until it stops being cold. He turned and walked through the door. The hall exhaled. Calavisan set down the document she'd been holding and looked at Kael. "Alpha, we'll need a formal council convening within 48 hours. Full review of everything on this table and whatever else is in that archive." "Agreed," Kael said. His voice was steady. His hands, at his sides, were not entirely steady, but he had them still. "I'll want the welfare records cross-referenced against our border territories records for the past 6 years, Edric Harrow said. "If the pattern of ghost distributions extended beyond the Blackthorne Pack boundaries, there's a much larger accounting to do." "Whatever you need," Serena said. Morwick looked at her. He had not said much since the hall had broken open, had simply stood and watched and read the room with the patience of a man who understood that his role in this particular night was to witness it accurately so he could speak about it truthfully afterward. He looked at her now with the specific quality of attention that very old people sometimes have. Not warm, not cold, just complete. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "Yes." "Your mother was a healer's assistant." She hadn't told anyone that here. She kept her expression even. "Yes." He nodded once, slowly, as though something had been confirmed. "Come see me tomorrow. There are things about this territory's history that you'll need to know that won't be in those records." He looked at Kael. "Both of you." He left. Calavicin left. Edric Harrow paused at the door and put his hand briefly on Leanna's shoulder, and Leanna looked at Serena across the hall with the particular expression of someone who has just been present for something that will organize the rest of their life into before and after. Then they were gone, and the hall was quiet, and it was Serena and Kael and Dara and Garrett in the torchlight with the documents spread across the table and the smell of old smoke and the first gray edge of dawn coming through the high windows. Dara sat down. She sat the way people sit when the structure that has been holding them upright has been removed, and sitting is what the body defaults to. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at her father's signature on the disbursement records and did not say anything for a long time. Garrett moved to the fire. He stood with his back to the room, giving her that. Kael walked to the window. He stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the gray that was not yet morning and not quite night, the specific color of a world that has not decided yet what it's going to be. Serena gave him that too. She sat at the far end of the table and waited, because she had learned in this keep that waiting was not the same as passivity, and that the hardest work was sometimes the work of staying in the room while someone else caught up. After a while, Dara said, "He believed it. That's the worst part." She said it to the table, not to anyone specifically. He didn't think of it as murder. He thought of it as management, risk control. Her voice was flat and very tired. He looked at Ilara the same way he looked at the accounts. Something that was threatening the structure. To be handled. Nobody answered her because nobody had an answer that would fit inside what she'd said. "I knew," she said. "Not all of it, but enough. For 2 years." She looked up at Serena. "I kept telling myself I needed more proof, more certainty, but that wasn't it." She stopped, started again. "I was afraid of what it would cost." "You sent the letter," Serena said, "at the last possible moment." "It was enough," Serena said. "It was what we needed." Dara looked at her. The same unguarded look she'd used in Serena's room, the one that had decided something. "You're going to need someone who knows this territory from the inside. Someone who can navigate the parts of it that aren't in any record." A pause. "If you want that." Serena held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "I want that." Dara nodded. She picked up the disbursement record nearest to her, turned it to face her, and started reading it with the focused attention of someone who has decided that work is what she has to offer, and she is going to offer it completely. Garrett turned from the fire and came to stand beside her and started reading too, the two of them side by side in the torchlight, the oldest enforcer in the pack and the daughter of the man who had just been walked out of the hall, finding the same page. Kael came away from the window. He walked to the table, not to the documents, to Serena. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the stripped, present look that had been in his face since the corridor and had not left, had only deepened through the night into something that did not have a name yet, but had the quality of permanence. "Come outside," he said. They went out through the main hall's side door into the smaller courtyard, the one with the stone bench and the herb beds that Serena had sat in with Leanna what felt like a different life ago. The cold was still complete, pre-dawn cold, the kind that sits on your skin and tells you exactly how early it is. The sky above the keep walls had gone from black to the specific blue-gray of imminent morning, and the first birds were starting, somewhere, not loudly. Kael sat on the bench. He looked at the turned soil of the herb beds for a moment, then at his hands. He had the look of a man engaged in a genuine accounting, not performance, not managed distance, but the real work of sitting with what he knew now and finding where it fit inside everything he'd believed before. Serena sat beside him, not close enough to require anything, not far enough to make distance a statement, just beside him, in the cold, in the early morning. "I dismissed you," he said. Every time you tried to tell me. Yes. I told you it was amateur analysis. You did. He looked at her. You kept going anyway. The alternative was letting it stay buried. He was quiet for a moment. Why did it matter to you? You'd been here 6 weeks. You had no history here. You owed this pack nothing. You owed me nothing. He said it without accusation, with the genuine puzzlement of a man trying to understand the mechanics of a decision he couldn't have made himself at the time. Why? Serena thought about it. She thought about her mother's ledger with no one to give it to, about Alara's workroom and the smell of cedar, about the 7 families who had submitted welfare requests that nobody processed, about Hadley's letter from Caldwell Territory with the unsigned lines at the bottom, about what it cost to know a thing and not say it. Because silence has a body count, she said, and I've seen it, and I don't want to be the person who saw it coming and kept quiet because the timing wasn't convenient. She looked at the herb beds, the cold-turned soil. It was also my pack. I know you didn't see it that way yet, but I did, from the first week. He sat with that for a moment. I failed you, he said, from the start, the way I... He stopped, started again with the careful effort of a man who is used to precise language in tactical contexts and is applying that precision to something that doesn't have tactical language. I looked past you. I chose to look past you every time, because taking you seriously would have required me to... He stopped again. To look at your family, she said. Yes. I know. He looked at her directly. How are you not angrier? It was such an honest question, coming from a man who was clearly angry at himself, at the years, at the specific shape of the night behind them, that it almost undid the composure she'd been maintaining since 5th hour. She felt it move through her, not grief exactly, not rage, the particular tiredness of a person who has been holding something heavy for a long time and can see for the first time a place where it might be set down. I'm tired, she said. Anger takes more energy than I have right now. She looked at the sky. Ask me in a week. Something moved across his face that was the first thing she'd seen on it that was not pain or control or the effort of managing both. Something that was, if she had to name it, the beginning of something else. My mother would have liked you, he said. She thought of Garrett saying the same thing inside, an hour ago, and the way it had landed then, like a key turning in something she hadn't known was locked. Tell me about her, Serena said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he started talking, and she listened, and the dawn came. The next weeks were the hardest work Serena had done in her life, and she had done hard work before. The council convened at 48 hours as Calavesine had required, and it ran for 6 days. Morwick presided. The Allied family heads attended every session. The documents were presented, cross-referenced, verified against external records that Edric Harrow's people pulled from 5 territories' supply chain logs. The welfare fund discrepancies expanded as they dug. Not just 7 ghost families, but 19, spanning 6 years, and the total diverted was large enough that when the final accounting was presented on the 4th day, the council chamber went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the specific silence of people confronting a number that changes what they thought they knew. Roderick faced the council on the 5th day. He was the same, composed, deliberate, the same managed face, and he made the same argument he'd made in the hall, which was that he had kept the territory functional and that the methods he'd used were the methods that the territory's scale and complexity required, and that anyone who sat in his position would eventually have made the same choices. What he had not anticipated was Garrett. Garrett testified for 2 hours. He was precise and specific and spoke without drama, in the flat, declarative cadence of a man recounting what he had seen and heard over 38 years. And what he had seen and heard included 3 conversations with Alara in the last month of her life, one of which he had not disclosed for 5 years because he had tried once and been unable to reach Kyle through his grief, and had concluded that trying again would only result in his removal from the pack. He had waited for someone who could open the door from the inside. Roderick's composure cracked on the 6th day, not dramatically. A hairline fracture, visible only because Serena had spent weeks learning to read the face underneath his face. It cracked when Morwick read Alar's letter aloud into the council record, every word in the council chamber's acoustic stillness, and the crack appeared at the phrase arrangements to ensure she would not be able to speak. And it didn't close again. He was exiled. Aldrich was exiled with him, with the additional condition that both men were barred from any administrative role in any Allied territory for a period to be reviewed by the full council in 5 years. The 5 enforcers who had committed to the private vote were demoted and placed under a 2-year review. The diverted funds were to be repaid from Roderick's personal holdings, and a reparations process for the affected families was to be established and administered by the Luna's office. The Luna's office. Serena sat in the council chamber when Morwick announced that and felt the phrase land in a new way. Not as a bureaucratic designation, not as the territory Aldrich had described in his office 6 weeks ago, narrow and ceremonial and managed. As something real, something with weight and jurisdiction and the responsibility of actual consequence. She had asked for that. She had understood, somewhere in the second week, that the question was not whether she could operate within the role as it had been defined, but whether she could redefine it as she operated, not through declaration, but through the simple accumulation of doing the work, of being present, of being, consistently and without performance, the person in the room who noticed what wasn't being said. The reparations process was the first thing she built from the ground up. She did it with Dara, who turned out to have an almost frightening command of the territory's administrative history, and who worked with the focused, slightly compulsive energy of a person making amends at the speed of guilt. They started with the 19 families. Letters first, then visits. Serena made them personally, not through staff, driving to the settlements herself with Leanna Harrow for context on local conditions. She sat in kitchens and in front rooms, and in one case in a barn because the family whose house it was didn't have a front room anymore. The house having been lost in a financial collapse 2 years prior that had exactly the shape of what happened when a welfare request was filed and the disbursement went somewhere else. She listened. She took notes. She did not promise things she wasn't certain she could deliver. She told each family that what had happened to them was documented, had been reviewed by the full council, and was being addressed, and she told them that the Luna's office was where they came now if anything else went wrong. 3 of the 19 families came to the office in the first month, not with complaints, just to see if it was real. KL was rebuilding at the same time, in the same territory, through a different set of rooms. The alliance relationships Roderick had threatened to take with him when he left turned out to be, in practice, more resilient than his prediction. Some of them were friendships. Most of them were arrangements of mutual interest, and mutual interest survived personnel changes because it was about the territories, not the men managing them. Calavicin sent an envoy within a week of the exile to discuss the Eastern supply agreements, not because she was owed anything, but because her territory shared a border with Blackthorne land, and a destabilized neighbor was no one's advantage. What the exile had actually stripped was the shadow authority, the informal back channels, the private dinners, the phone calls that happened before formal meetings where the decisions were already made, the infrastructure of a man who had made himself the only door. Without it, Kael had to learn to negotiate differently, to sit at tables where he was not the inevitable conclusion, but one party among several, and to build agreements that held because they were good agreements, rather than because the alternative was dealing with Roderick. He was not bad at it. He was, she thought, watching him across a council table 2 months into the new structure, actually better at it than he'd been at the old version, because the old version had required him to perform a certainty he didn't always feel, and the new version allowed him to ask questions. He had started asking questions. The sitting room door was no longer locked from either side. It had unlocked on its own, essentially. No conversation about it, no formal acknowledgement. It had simply become unnecessary at some point in the weeks after the night in the hall, and Serena had opened the door one morning to find Kael in the sitting room with 2 cups of coffee and a territory map spread on the table that he had apparently been studying for some time and wanted a second opinion on. She had given the second opinion. The coffee had been good. That had been, in its way, the turning point. Not the night in the hall, not the council session, not any of the specific conversations they'd had about his mother or her history or the territory or what they were going to build. A cup of coffee and a territory map, and the particular easiness of two people who had been through something genuinely hard together and had come out on the other side still interested in each other's thinking. They did not rush what was between them. Neither of them was built for rushing, it turned out, and they were both carrying things that required time to carry. Kael, the weight of 6 years misread, of a grief that had been clean and specific and had now become something more complicated with the truth in it, of the specific guilt of a man who had looked past the person who was trying to help him and was learning to reckon with what that had cost. Serena, the particular loneliness of a woman who had spent her life watching and cataloging and had learned to make herself small enough to be underestimated, and was now learning, slowly and with some difficulty, that she did not have to make herself small anymore, that the room was large enough, that the territory was large enough, that Kael Blackthorne was, in fact, large enough. The day he stood in front of the full assembled pack was 3 months after the haul. It was a clear day, cold but dry, and the pack had gathered in the main courtyard that Serena had watched from her window in the first weeks here, the training ground where flags snapped in the wind. It was not a ceremony exactly. There was no formal structure to it. Kael had asked for the pack to come together, and they had come. 2,000 wolves in the courtyard, and on the walls and in the windows above, and he stood at the center without a dais, at ground level, which was a choice she had not suggested but had noticed him make. He spoke for about 15 minutes. He was not a performative speaker. He did not build to rhetorical peaks or use the calculated pauses of a man who has been told he is good at this. He spoke the way he did everything, directly, with the specific weight of a man putting words behind a commitment that already existed and was merely being stated now for the record. He told them what had happened. Not a sanitized version, not the administrative summary that had circulated through the council documentation. The actual account. His uncle. His mother. The 6 years. His own failure to see it, which he named as a failure without softening it into understandable mistake or forgivable grief. Because he understood now that one of the ways the structure had held was through his unwillingness to look, and naming that was part of dismantling it. The pack was very quiet. Then he said, "The Luna's office has begun the reparations process. If you have unresolved welfare requests or disputes from the past 6 years, bring them there. That's what it's for." A pause. "That's what she's for." He looked at her across the courtyard. 2,000 wolves, and he looked directly at her with the clear, unmanaged directness that she had been watching develop in him over 3 months, and she held it. "She saw it before I did," he said. "She built this before I believed it. I'm telling you that because you should know who you're dealing with, and because I spent the first weeks of this bond treating her like an inconvenience, and that's a thing I'll spend a long time accounting for." He looked back at the assembled pack. "She's not a political necessity. She's not a ceremonial function. She's the person who walked into a keep that was rotten underneath and started pulling at threads when it was dangerous to pull, and she didn't stop." He let that sit. "That's what a Luna is. That's what this one is. And if any of you have something to say to her, you say it to her face, and you say it with respect, because she has earned every inch of standing in this territory, and she'll keep earning it." The courtyard was still for a moment. Then Garrett started. Just Garrett, a single pair of hands, and then the sound spread the way sound spreads when it's actually felt rather than performed, one pair of hands at a time, until the courtyard was full of it. Serena stood in the middle of the pack that had called her sickly and fragile and a political mistake in the rain on her bonding day, and she let the sound land on her. Not overwhelming, not transforming, just real. Just the simple physical fact of being seen. That evening she sat in the eastern wing, not in Alara's workroom. The workroom had been cleared and cataloged, everything in it properly archived now, accessible, documented. She sat in the small sitting room at the wing's entrance with a cup of tea and the specific quiet of a space that has been properly grieved and is ready to be used again. Kael found her there. He came in without ceremony and sat in the chair across from her, and they were quiet for a while with the comfortable silence of people who have moved through enough noise together that silence is no longer uncomfortable. "Morik wants to expand the Luna's office formally," he said. "Give it its own council seat." "I know. He told me." "Do you want it?" She thought about it genuinely. "Yes," she said, "with the right scope." "Tell me what the right scope is." She told him. He listened. He asked 3 questions, 2 of which pushed back on specifics, and 1 of which was purely to understand. They talked for an hour about structure and responsibility and what accountability actually looked like when you built it into the foundation instead of laying it on top as decoration. It was, she thought, the best conversation she'd had in this keep, and she'd had some good ones by now. At some point, she said, "Your mother hid that letter knowing someone would find it eventually." "Yes." She trusted that someone would come who knew where to look. He looked at her across the small room, the candle between them, the wing quiet around them, cedar and old stone, and the specific piece of a space that has been through its worst and is still standing. "She was right," he said. Serena looked at him, at the scar on his jaw and the shadows that were no longer exhaustion, and the eyes that had found a way to be present in a room that they'd spent years avoiding. At the man who had spent 3 months learning to ask questions and was getting better at it every week. "She was right about a lot of things," Serena said. He stood, moved to the chair beside her instead of across, sat again, close enough that she could hear him breathe. His hand on the arm of the chair was near hers, not touching, just near, the way things are when they have decided to be near and are letting that fact exist without forcing it to be more than it is yet. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was quiet and had the texture of something he'd been deciding whether to say for a while. "The night of the hall, the morning after, when Morwick read her letter in the council session." He stopped. "I kept waiting to fall apart, to lose the structure. I've been thinking about why I didn't." She waited. "It was because you were already there," he said. "Every time I looked up, you were in the room, working, reading something, or talking to Dara, or going over the accounts with Garrett, just present. Like the floor was still there." He looked at her. "You were the floor." She sat with that. The candle burned. Outside the wing's narrow windows, the territory was dark and quiet. 40,000 wolves settled into their evening routines. The border enforcers on their rotations, the settlements with their lights and their kitchens, the families she'd been visiting and would continue to visit, the work that was not finished and would not be finished but was being done. "You would have found the floor," she said. "You were already looking for it." "Maybe." He looked at their hands, close on the chair arms. "But I didn't have to do it alone." She turned her hand over. Not a dramatic gesture, just the hand open, a small and simple fact. His hand moved, covered hers, stayed. They sat in Alara's sitting room in the quiet of the eastern wing, and the territory settled around them in the dark, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said right now, and they had both learned, through different kinds of suffering, by different routes, that the truest things did not require words to hold them, that sometimes the truest things were just a hand in the dark, and the simple, extraordinary fact of someone choosing to stay. The Blackthorne name did not disappear. Names rarely did, in territories with long memories. But what it meant changed, the way things change when the people carrying them change, slowly, then completely, the way water changes stone, not through force, but through the patient, unremarkable fact of being present for long enough. The wolves who had stood in the rain on the bonding day and looked past Serena Vale would find it harder to remember as the months accumulated what exactly they had seen when they looked past her. What they saw now was the Luna who had opened the reparations office and staffed it with Dara Blackthorne and Leanna Harrow and an older she-wolf named Petra, who had spent 22 years watching and deciding that it was finally worth it to stop watching and start doing. What they saw was the woman who showed up to the Eastern settlement on a cold Tuesday morning with an accountant and a list and sat at a kitchen table until the numbers made sense. What they saw was the person Kyle Blackthorne looked at across every council table and every courtyard and every quiet evening with the specific attention of a man who has learned the difference between looking at someone and seeing them. And what they understood slowly was that the strength they'd been watching all along, the thing they'd been calling fragile, calling weak, calling a political mistake, was not something that had appeared. It had been there from the beginning. It had been there in the rain. It had just required the right conditions to become visible, the way certain materials require pressure before they show you what they're actually made of. Serena Vale, Luna of the Blackthorne territory, understood this and did not require anyone to acknowledge it. The acknowledgement was not the point. The point was the work. The point was the 40,000 wolves in the territory she had claimed as hers in the second week of her residence, before anyone thought she had any right to, and the work of making that claim mean something real. Real power, she had learned, from her mother in a healer's back room, from a dead woman's letter hidden behind a jar on a shelf, from 6 weeks of being overlooked in a house that was rotten underneath. Real power was not the kind that required others to be smaller. It was not the kind that hoarded exits or managed information or arranged the room so that every door opened on your side. It was the kind that could sit with the truth about itself and not look away. The kind that could be wrong and say so. The kind that could look at a corrupt structure and refuse to accept that the structure was the same as the territory. The kind, in the end, that could stand in a hall before dawn with a dead woman's letter in its hand and the entire empire arranged against it, and say, "This is what is true, and I will say it in this room until someone hears it." Outside the window of the eastern wing, the territory was dark and breathing and holy quietly itself. The candle burned down. Neither of them moved to replace it.